Mindful of the fact that I am the last speaker on what has been a very long day of presentations, you'll be pleased to hear that this is quite a concise presentation. So you're looking forward to the Chardonnay probably that's just around the corner. So I'll be very, very merciful indeed. So here be prophets. If you mention the name Val Morgan these days, you can't help but smell popcorn or feel the crack of a choc top as you're eating away. But of course, Val Morgan, or his full name, Valentine Morgan, born in 1876, was in fact one of Melbourne's first most notable of his time, pioneering advertising agents. Picture there. He was extremely well versed in the powerful, seductive potential of the printed image. His print advertising used all of the typographic hallmarks of the early advertising age, as you can see there, heavily embellished lettering, unapologetically loud display typefaces, snappy headlines, and of course a typographic device that is found on any compositor's tray of the time, the pointing finger, otherwise known as the index or printer's fist. In fact, there are many other names for it, but I'll stop there. Used to quite literally point readers' eye to the key message, this pointing finger motif offered the very strategic Val Morgan an opportunity to perform a clever secondary role. That is, of course, for the covers of his new Morgan's Street Directory, in which the pointing finger device offered a perfect dual reading. Firstly, it could communicate a wayfinding system, which of course is the primary function of any map or directory, but as well as that, of course, it's a very bold, very bold graphic to identify the directory with considerable advertising potential, and I'll come back to advertising because it's central to this entire thing. This is, of course, the primary intent of the Morgan's Street Directory. There we have it there. Lovely, isn't it? Morgan's purchase of the Molten Street Directory business, which had failed after its only edition in 1916, proved to be an astute and well-timed move. In the newly motorised, and there we go, we finally got to the car bit, you'll be glad to hear. In the newly motorised streetscape of 1917 Melbourne, the emergence of the new Morgan Street Directory responded to a need to know what lay beyond what was within walking distance. As early as 1922, Val Morgan, anticipating his future cinema advertising empire, produced glass slides advertising the modernity and utility of his directory. Press ads in the Argus boldly stated that 80 picture theatres nightly were telling people about the Morgan's Street Directory, the new issue, revised and up to date, on sale at all good booksellers. It has a blue cover and fits easily into the pocket. And that's a very important thing. Early Morgan's Street Directory covers feature an illustrated hand. This is the earliest one in my own collection, with a rather grotesque, gnarled and long-nailed pointing finger, more akin to sort of Nosferatu than the intended genteel aspiration. That, of course, would be, for all those people into German Expressionism. By the 1960s, however, the pointed hand was steadily evolved into a simpler black silhouette. It's still got the nails, but it's nowhere near as creepy. And although the title lettering steadily evolved over the 60 issues, it is the pointing hand that remains the emblematic and striking identity design for Morgan's. Whereas early cartographers, fearing the unknown empty spaces at the outer fringes of their maps, would declare a warning to potential explorers, "Here be dragons," for Morgan, every blank space on the Morgan Street Directory represented an advertising opportunity, or "Here be profits." But of course, this strategy proved to have an ironic fate. As an ever-expanding Melbourne was transforming over open ground into new residential or industrial estates, previously blank rural areas began to, of course, fill up. So that as Melbourne grew, advertising had to steadily be moved from inside the maps to the frames around the borders and even to the front cover itself. So he was literally undoing his advertising plan as Melbourne was steadily developing. And you can see how extraordinarily blank those areas are. Now, of course, it's absolutely, completely and utterly built, even beyond those edges, of course. Morgan's use as a mapping system, as a vehicle for commercial gain, gently anticipates one of the most current and ubiquitous maps, of course, which is Google Maps. Despite one being local and the other being global in its reach, both present themselves as the important reference of their time, blurring the difference between civic and mercantile intention. Here we are. Compared to many of the other entrepreneurial ventures that Val Morgan produced, such as his failed attempt to advertise messages on spinning car wheel hubcaps. I would have loved to have seen that. The directory did in fact turn a profit. As an interview with Valentine Charles Morgan, grandson of the original founder, the archive that's in the SLV, says, "We were not booksellers and therefore we didn't really understand the trade. But the Morgan directory was very much a sideline, and the job putting a new edition together was periodic. It wasn't a major money spinner, but it was most certainly profitable. As long as the sale price covered the printing, our profit was in the advertising." The confidence of the post-war building boom meant that a new directory had to be published about every year or 18 months. To ensure that the directory kept pace with the city's development, the draftsman, Alf Yorson, would visit councils and learn of new housing subdivisions and new streets, and he would then amend his meticulous maps or draw new ones. The directory soon became a very popular and reliable point of reference, and not just for the general community. As proclaimed in its later covers, you can probably see some there, Morgan's was used by the police and the fire brigade for reliability and rapid location. It was often quoted in the newspaper columns at the time as an important reference for getting around the city and suburbs. In fact, the currency of the directory was so high that the Argus reported them being stolen regularly from police cars. Astounding. Compared to its counterparts in other Australian cities, the pages of the Morgan's directory was very well covered in advertising, mainly from local estate agents hungry for a market presence throughout the new burgeoning Melbourne suburbs. As the founder's grandson recalls, every time a new street directory was about to come out, you would have to go back to the people who had previously advertised and convince them that they should be in the new book. The directory, was sold cheaply, but it was a profitable venture because of the inclusion of a large number of advertisements. So at its height, it was said to have held 90% of the market, which is quite astounding, with only minimal competition from Collins, Sands McDougall, and of course UBD, or Universal Business Directories. The first directory, one of the first, although I've actually got the first here. The first directory was a small 3x5-inch hardcover made of 320 pages with what were rudimentary maps and indexes to government services, associations and hospitals, cemeteries, asylums, there were many asylums, and hospitals. The format was overhauled in 1931 when a large size book, was produced with new maps in it. One of the devices to keep print costs down was to use the same printing plates every single year and just change the colours. And that's actually what I'm particularly interested in, is that kind of embedded seriality, I guess you could call it, that they are incredibly similar. Every time I buy one, I think this is exactly the same as all my others, except that the date has slightly changed. Quite lovely. Many issues, of course, have no dates marked on them at all, which makes it very hard for collectors. Considered by its makers as a mere sideline to the Val Morgan cinema advertising empire, the directory content of later issues was only lightly updated from year to year. This was, of course, until a new competitor arrived, and we can all guess what that is. As Morgan acknowledged as the grandson acknowledged, in the mid-1960s, the first Melways street directory was produced. The Melways was an excellent directory, and from the very first issue, we realised we had a very major problem. I had collected and studied street directories from all around the world and was convinced that our book was the best. Unfortunately, now it is second best. Morgan's response was to approach the proprietor of Melways, a meticulous cartographer, with an offer to purchase his business. This was declined. And so in the late 1960s, Morgan had every map of the directory redrawn and a new format was adopted. Prior to Melways, our best circulation was 80,000 copies, but it started to decline, and gradually the cost of printing became prohibitive because of the reduced print run. With great regret, we made the commercial decision and ceased publication in 1976. You can see there are some of the larger directories. Yep. That is, of course, is the hideous one of the last issues where the pointing finger is no longer present, which is a pity. Perhaps the most telling record of this directory's appeal took the form of an Argus obituary of Valentine Morgan in 1952. Although cinema advertising constituted the vast majority of his business empire, he was ultimately described as the man behind the famous Morgan's Street Directory that had solved the problems of Melbourne visitors for years. One could not have asked for more of a glowing endorsement of Morgan, who, at the end of the day, who was an advertising pioneer who also became the accidental cartographer. Thank you.